This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we will be discussing traumatic brain injuries, or TBIs, and substance use disorders with DRNY staff attorney Amanda Pearlstein. Amanda, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So in February of this year, there was a great article in the New York Times where Senator Harkin was talking about legalization of marijuana, as well as making some reference to his own life and challenges with substance abuse. And for those of our audience who are unfamiliar with how these two subjects go together, TBIs as well as substance use disorders, can you talk about that article itself, and what did that really mean for him to come out in such a public way to address this issue head on?
One of the things that I found so impressive about Senator Harkin's statement is that it's hard for anyone to come out about having a disability or an illness, and especially for something that's as stigmatized and as misunderstood as substance use disorders. It's really powerful to hear from somebody who's in a position of authority and in a position of power to basically acknowledge that he's had those struggles, which was very commendable, and has been working on some really good legislation, which I'm going to get into later. But I think as the TBI attorney in this program, what really stood out to me is I've worked with so many clients who've had an overlap of traumatic brain injury and substance use disorders, and that really compelled me to look further into that connection and to kind of see whether there was an overlap between TBI and substance use. And what I found is that there's really a huge connection.
I think that's so interesting, and to have this subject, brought to light not only through the New York Times, but as he spoke about it on the Senate floor, and really addressing what you just said, that stigma is the biggest issue out there facing this population, this community, as well as these issues. And I find it fascinating that we have this as kind of a new idea, or something that maybe is just being brought to light, that these two subject matters are in fact so intrinsically connected. So let's talk about TBI for our audience members who don't know what it is. Can you speak to that? Tell us what it is.
Yeah, so TBI stands for traumatic brain injury, and it's essentially what it sounds like, any kind of injury to one's brain. It can range from things as mild as a concussion to very severe brain injuries that can result in coma or persistent vegetative state. So it's a really massive range. And TBI, at least according to the New York State's definitions that we work with in terms of the programs, it encompasses ABI, or acquired brain injury, which is brain injury from things like stroke, from lack of oxygen to the brain for various reasons, drowning or things like that. So it's a pretty wide definition, and it's a very common type of injury. You see TBI in, most famously, I would say, soldiers and people who are football players. We're really just discovering how repeated concussions can lead to CTE and severe kind of long-term brain damage. Right now, there are 5.5 million Americans living with disabilities related to TBI, and actually probably millions more who have sustained a TBI and fully recovered. So it's a very substantial percent of the population.
And it's a big spectrum too, right? I mean, there are varying degrees of how a TBI can be affecting someone, and whether or not they're in a position to have a complete recovery, or if they're going to learn to live with TBI. I know we've said it in many other ways. If you meet one person with a TBI, you've met one person. Is that fair to say?
Very much so, yeah. And even if it's considered the same level of injury, if it's, say, a mild TBI or a serious concussion, people could have the same injury and come away with very different effects. Some people might have alterations to their mood or to their behaviors. Some wouldn't have those effects, but might have chronic headaches or other kinds of chronic pain as a result.
So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation. And so let's get into this connection between TBIs and substance use disorders. Give us a little bit of background, and how is it that you started to look at this correlation and how it's really vetting out?
So the interplay between substance use disorders and TBI is really complex and kind of flows both ways. So you have a large amount of people who sustain a TBI have pre-existing substance use disorders. And in fact, those disorders may cause the TBI in the first place. For instance, somebody who is driving while intoxicated and gets into a car accident, somebody who ODs, and particularly with opioids, if you OD on an opioid and your breathing is repressed, you lose oxygen to the brain, And if you're not revived in time, that can cause TBI. So that's a huge kind of issue. And then on the other side of that, you have people who have TBI who've never had substance abuse problems develop those problems after sustaining their TBI. And that's as high as 10 to 20% of people with TBI who've never used substances before, never had a substance use disorder, end up developing one. And so that can happen for a number of reasons, obviously, ranging from just the emotional impact, dealing with the loss of certain functions. It can be really devastating for people, and they might turn to drugs or alcohol to cope with that. TBIs can also cause, independently of just emotional trauma of the experience, can lead to things like depression and anxiety and other psychiatric disorders as a result of the TBI, which then again, one might want to self-medicate. People with TBI also typically are more likely to take risks and have lower inhibition compared to their pre-injury state, less impulse control and less ability to think about long-term consequences, all of which can lead to experimentation with drugs and with developing addictions. Also, in certain cases, people with TBI may be more vulnerable to manipulation or influence by people who don't have their best interests at heart and may get them involved in drugs. So there's a huge range here.
Yeah, it really does seem to stretch across a very broad range of people as well as situations that can bring from one side to the other. Now, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, otherwise known as ASAM, they recently revised their definition of addiction to a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experience. What does this mean for the science of addiction?
This is a great development because it really is solidifying what the scientific and medical world has come to understand about the nature of addiction, which I think kind of has yet to fully trickle down to society at large. There's very much still this perception in our society that addiction is a moral failing or a personal weakness of some kind. Whereas in reality, we've become aware that there are so many factors that can lead to substance use disorders, none of which are being a weak person. It's factors, genetics and brain chemistry, emotional trauma can change those circuits. There's overlap with mental illness. And there are structural factors, poor economic prospects, poor working conditions that can all really combine to predispose someone to substance use disorder. So I think it's really important that addiction is being recognized as a medical disease. It also helps us be better able to fund treatment that we would for any other disease and to decrease that shame and stigma that's still so prevalent.
And with these really huge changes coming specifically from the medical field, what changes in the current laws or new bills will need to follow this new definition? Will there be new direction in these laws based on this new finding?
So the changes that are kind of the most exciting to me are the ones to do with criminal justice reform, because as I'm sure most people know, America leads the world in the percentage of people who are incarcerated and the numbers of incarcerations. And in the past decade or so, I think our country is coming to realize that this mass incarceration, and particularly the war on drugs, has been this very cruel mistake that has caused a lot of damage to society. And as we've come to recognize that, and the fact that we have so many people locked up for long term due to drug-related offenses, I think we're really turning towards reform in those areas. And we've seen a lot of promising reform, particularly in terms of how nonviolent and low-level drug crimes are addressed. And then at the same time, another major development in our society over the past decade has been the rise of this opioid crisis. Opioid deaths are actually beginning to level off, but have been rising steadily from 2010 to 2017. It was this massive increase in deaths and in real decimation of especially poor rural communities. It's been devastating across the country. And so the government has been trying to react to this crisis while simultaneously trying to not repeat the same mistakes that it made during the war on drugs.
I think your point to the criminal justice system is not only fair, but as we look at, as you said, how the opioid crisis has particularly affected an economic community, it has definitely then influenced the rate of other crimes to be committed based on that. So that's a really interesting point to make. So let's talk about how these issues can be resolved with new laws and bills. Who's responsible for these changes?
So you mentioned at the beginning of the interview the talk with Senator Harckham about the policies that the state Senate has been implementing. And I think there have been some really great developments in New York just recently last month the Senate passed this whole slate of bills related to the opioid crisis and their responses. And there's some really fabulous components of these bills. If you don't mind, I could run through a few of them.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so basically new training materials for OASIS, which is the Office of Alcohol and Substance Abuse Services, for screening, intervention, and referrals to treatment. New trainings for medication prescribers and for mental health professionals. There were a whole variety of bills about increasing access to naloxone and other overdose reversal drugs, which is vital to saving lives of people who have overdosed. They introduced a chemical dependence treatment bill of rights and a bill, I believe Stevens Law, that was to create easier paths of communication between the provider and emergency contacts with the patient's consent, which is actually a side note I wanted to bring up. One of the risks you run with responses to drug crises is that the legislation is going to be unduly coercive and violate people's civil liberties. There's a chance that they'll want to increase involuntary commitments, things like that. I haven't seen a lot of that from these bills, which is great. I mean, these seem to be much more focused on the rights of the individual with the substance use disorder, which is very good. They've come up with best practice guidelines for recovery housing, and we'll be having reports done on drug treatment in jails and prisons, which is vital and which is very is an underserved population. The Senate also put together this joint task force on opioids, addiction, and overdose prevention with recommendations. One of the ones, again, that I found really compelling was about reducing incarceration for low-level drug offenses and to stop sending people back to jail for failing a drug test, which is often a condition of parole or probation. And that can be devastating for someone who is attempting to recover, and relapse can often be a component of recovery. And for that to go unrecognized and for people to be put back in conditions of incarceration can really throw the recovery completely off. So having a more empathetic, humane system for dealing with people in the criminal justice system who have addiction will be huge.
So as these changes are moving forward, and it looks like we have support coming from lawmakers to really address these issues, where will DRNY fall in this? Will we have more people who we've either been working with, or will more people be able to reach out to us based on these new guidelines and these new laws? Is this something that changes the way that we do business?
That's an interesting question. Addiction is recognized in the ADA as a disability, but with more limited parameters than other forms of disabilities. I know, for instance, of employment discrimination, you're protected if you have a history of drug abuse or of alcoholism, but not if you're currently using, which on its face seems like, okay, sure, we don't want people coming to work high. But on the other hand, the reason that those protections would be important is, say, if somebody wanted to enter treatment, they wouldn't be protected under the law. That's a really important thing to consider.
Okay. I think it's important for our audience to know where we stand with that. And we're getting ready to wrap up. So before we sign off, is there anything else that you'd like our audience to know?
Addiction and substance use disorders affect people from all walks of life, all levels of education, all races, genders, everything. If you are listening to this and you're somebody who is dealing with this right now, it is a treatable condition, and it is not something to be ashamed of or any personal weakness. And addiction can be treated and you can recover.
Really well said, Amanda. Thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Great. Thank you so much.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed caption version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights closed captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.